Hello, this is just a reminder that this podcast has merch and a Patreon, and there's also a Fiverr gig and some affiliated links. The links to everything that I just mentioned are in the show notes. Alright, now enjoy the show. I just need to give a quick content warning. In this episode, there's murder and suicide, so if that sort of thing bothers you, then you might want to skip this episode. Alright, well, let's get started. She's the kind of book that you can't put down. Like if Cleopatra grew up in a small town. That is what Taylor Swift sings in her song When Emma Falls in Love. There are so many historical figures that Miss Swift could have chosen to put in that song. So, why did she go with Cleopatra? Well, the song describes a woman that is enchanting. A woman so charming she could turn the bad boys into good boys if they only had the chance to love her. If there was one thing that Cleopatra did not lack, that was charisma. She had so much charm that powerful men decided to follow her, consequences be damned. So, let's see what it was about Cleopatra that made her so dazzling. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the second episode of the 5th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. Welcome to Season 5 of History Shelf. This season is titled History, Taylor's Version. That is because these 14 people that I will be covering this season all have one thing in common. The one thing they have in common is they all have been name-dropped in a Taylor Swift song. Now, don't stop listening if you are not a fellow Swiftie like me. This season is not going to be about Taylor Swift. You don't have to be a Swiftie to enjoy this season. You just have to be a history lover. So please, stay. What we are going to do is you and I are going to go on a little adventure that spans 2,404 years. Who I am going to cover this season are fearless leaders, people from the screen, poets straight from the Tortured Poets department, and people who were just trying to find a place in this world. Some of these stories may be stories of happiness. They may be sad, beautiful, tragic, but long story short, I hope that you will be enchanted to get to know the stories of these historical figures all too well. So, are you ready for it? For this week, I am talking about Cleopatra VII. Queen Cleopatra was born Cleopatra VII via Philippator in either 69 or 70 BC in Alexandria, Egypt. We know for sure that her father was Ptolemy XII Auletes. He was the pharaoh of Egypt. We are not 100% sure on who Cleopatra's mother was. She was probably Cleopatra V Tryphena. Our Cleopatra's parents were probably either cousins or brother and sister. Now, I know that that might sound strange to a modern audience, but during this time and place, it wasn't. This was common among Egyptian royals, which gives a new meaning to the term sister wife. This had to do with their religion. The ancient Egyptians worshipped multiple gods. Two of the gods they worshipped were Osiris and Isis. This god and goddess were brother and sister, and they were also married. The pharaohs of Egypt, which pharaohs was what the rulers of Egypt were called, the pharaohs of Egypt liked to align themselves with gods. So that was a reason why sibling marriages were common. Another reason why that they did this was Mayet. Mayet is an ancient Egyptian goddess, but Mayet is also the personification of truth, cosmic balance, and justice. The ancient Egyptian royals believed that they needed to keep their bloodline pure, and the way to do that was to marry and mate with their siblings. A son born to a pharaoh and his sister was seen as having the purest blood. They thought that keeping their bloodline pure, that they were ensuring the cosmic balance. They also did this to ensure a clear line of succession. This also ensured that power stayed in the pharaoh's lineage because none of the royal children married into other families. This could minimize potential disputes for the throne. Minimize, not eliminate. Remember that for later. They also felt that they could trust their family more than they could an outsider, and so sibling marriages became a tradition. And sticking to tradition also helped reinforce a pharaoh's legitimacy. Going with tradition and doing what the gods do helped prove that they had been chosen by the gods to rule. Now, sibling marriages were not something that commoners practiced, but they were not seen as divine, so they weren't supposed to follow the gods. So, like I said earlier, it is quite possible that Cleopatra's parents were siblings. And that brings me to the question, was Cleopatra black? This question has stirred up some controversy, especially in recent years. There is a possibility that Cleopatra was partially black, but maybe she wasn't. Her family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, was Macedonian Greek, so Cleopatra's ancestors came from the same place that Aristotle came from, the subject of last week's episode. There is a possibility that she had some Persian and Iranian ancestry, but it is unknown if she had any African. Coins and busts of Cleopatra portrayed her as Greek, and Cleopatra would have had to approve those coins, but did she approve them because that's what she looked like? Or did she approve them because that's what she wanted to be portrayed as? The coins also portray her as having masculine features, and again, was that because that's what she looked like, or was that because that's what she wanted people to see her as? Cleopatra actually descended from Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy. So Alexander the Great is making another cameo on this podcast. But there's a possibility that somewhere along her lineage, someone may have had a child with a concubine. That concubine may have been Egyptian. So, like I said, it's really unclear if she did have any African blood, and if she did, how much of it did she have? We don't. I will also say this. There had to have, at least on occasion, been outsiders that were breeding with Cleopatra's family, because there's no way that her family would have been able to survive if they were just having sex with each other. Because inbreeding causes infertility. If you want to know what inbreeding for generations does, look up King Charles II of Spain. He was infertile due to inbreeding. He also had a lot of other problems that I'm not going to get into. I probably will cover him in a future season. So, there's no way that Cleopatra's family would have been able to survive all the way back from Alexander the Great's general to her if they didn't have anybody on the outside mingling with her family. Cleopatra may have not had any Egyptian blood, but she did learn the Egyptian language, Coptic, and some people have wondered if the reason why that she did learn that language was because she was partly Egyptian. And like I said, again, we don't know. It's a possibility that she just learned it because she wanted to learn it, and probably because she thought that this would be a good idea to learn the language of the people that she was ruling over, especially if she wanted to get them on her side. Cleopatra was not an only child. We know that Ptolemy XII had at least 5 children. His oldest was his daughter Berenice IV. Then the birth order goes Cleopatra, his daughter Arsinoe IV, his son Ptolemy XIII, and then his son Ptolemy XIV. There may have been a daughter that was older than Berenice, and her name was also Cleopatra, but nothing is certain. Shortly after Cleopatra was born, her mother disappeared from the records. So she probably died shortly after Cleopatra was born. If that is the case, then Cleopatra's younger siblings probably were her half-siblings. So Arsinoe and the Ptolemies. I'm so sorry that there are a lot of Ptolemies in this story, and if you think there can't possibly be any more, just wait, because there are so many more. A long ass time ago, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. It was even a long time for Cleopatra. I think it is easy to think all these ancient figures were just hanging out and chilling with each other, but in fact, there was quite a few years between Alexander the Great and Cleopatra. Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BC, so again, a long fucking time before Cleopatra. When Alexander took over Egypt, Egypt was not doing great. When Alexander's general took over, he just adapted to Egypt's customs, including royals marrying their siblings. In Egypt, the queen wasn't completely powerless. She wasn't there just to give birth to sons, but the king, or pharaoh, had most of the power. Also, murder and betrayal was just everyday things that took place during this time. So keep all of this in mind as we... In 58 BC, Cleopatra's father was forced into exile by courtiers in Alexandria. The reason why Ptolemy XII had to go into exile was because Rome wanted to annex Egypt into Rome. So that would have ended Egypt's independence. Ptolemy XII didn't want that to happen, so he started sending Roman statesmen some nice swag to try and sway their votes in his favor. This had a negative impact on Egypt's finances. That made him unpopular with the Egyptian people because, well, people don't like being poor. Cleopatra's sister, Berenice, took over the throne and ruled with Cleopatra VI, who may have been her and Cleopatra's mother/aunt or their sister/cousin. But that did not last long because Cleopatra VI died shortly after Cleopatra's father left. Berenice probably killed Cleopatra VI or had Cleopatra VI killed. So then Berenice was the sole ruler. She didn't marry either one of her brothers because they were too young. So Cleopatra's father went to Rome, and he probably took Cleopatra VII, the star of this episode, with him. He got some help from Rome to take back his throne. The year was 55 BC, and by this time Berenice was married to a man named Archelaus, because remember, women can't rule on their own. She was actually on her second marriage. Her first marriage was to a man named Seleucus. That marriage only lasted a few days because he was vulgar and Berenice did not like him, so she had him strangled. Cleopatra's father went marching into Egypt with some Roman troops. Berenice's second husband was killed in battle, and Cleopatra's father took back his throne, and then he had his daughter Berenice executed. Then Ptolemy number 12 died in 51 BC. Cleopatra was about 18 years old at this time. Ptolemy number 12's wish was that his son, Ptolemy number 13, was to rule with Cleopatra. Ptolemy number 13 was just 10 years old when his father died. Ptolemy number 13 didn't have any experience, but Cleopatra did. She had been ruling with her father, and she was also very well educated. She could speak 9 languages, and she was said to have had a beautiful speaking voice. Though apparently she wasn't conventionally beautiful for her time. No one wrote down that she was ugly, but they also didn't write down that she was beautiful either. And during this time, if someone was conventionally beautiful, people would take note of that. And they especially would have taken note of that in Cleopatra's case. And you will see why later. Not that it really matters. I never want to reduce someone's worth down to their beauty, especially a woman's, because that happens to us all the time, and beauty is subjective, but I wanted to include that because I see a lot of times people will say that Cleopatra was ugly, and that's not necessarily what the people of her time were saying about her. They just didn't say that she was drop-dead gorgeous. So because Cleopatra was co-ruling with Ptolemy number 13, they probably got married. So Ptolemy number 13 went from being Cleopatra's brother to being her brother husband. Even though there's a good chance that Cleopatra had no Egyptian blood in her, she still styled herself after the Egyptian goddess Isis. And she was taking a page out of the book of another Ptolemaic queen named Cleopatra. Cleopatra III. Cleopatra number 7 also claimed to be the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. Cleopatra built some sacred religious statues during her reign, like the Maltese bull. It was a rough time in Egypt when Cleopatra inherited the throne. There was a famine going on during this time because of a drought and the annual flooding of the Nile, and there were some Roman legionaries and cavalrymen known as the Gabinians that were running around Egypt and causing trouble. They were there because they were the ones that helped Cleopatra's father get his throne back. Cleopatra also inherited her father's debt when she took the throne. Cleopatra owed the Roman Republic a lot of money. Now, Cleopatra was co-ruling with her probably brother husband, but let me remind you that he was a literal child. So Cleopatra decided that she didn't want to rule with an actual child. So she just took over. Her probably brother husband was not cool with this. By August of 51 BC, official documents stated that Cleopatra was the sole ruler of Egypt. Also around this time was when Julius Caesar and Pompey were at war with each other. I am telling you this now because Julius Caesar is going to have a big role in this story. Julius Caesar and Pompey were both Romans. Caesar was Pompey's father-in-law. Pompey was married to Caesar's daughter, Julia. After Julia died, Caesar and Pompey's relationship soured. Caesar had the governorship of Gaul, that is modern-day France and Belgium. Caesar's power kept growing, and Pompey got a little jealous of Caesar. There was another leader during this time named Crassus, but he is not important to this story. Crassus and Pompey didn't like each other, but they all three patched things up and went about ruling their corners of the earth. Crassus ruled Syria, and Pompey ruled Spain, and Caesar had Gaul. Crassus died in 53 BC, and Pompey then told Caesar to disband his army and go back to Rome as a private citizen. Well, there was no fucking way that was going to happen. So, civil war was declared. Now back to Cleopatra and Ptolemy number 13. Cleopatra was acting like she was the sole ruler. Her advisors were backing her up with this. She was having coins minted that just had her face instead of her and Ptolemy number 13's face. But Ptolemy number 13 also had advisors, and they and Ptolemy number 13 were pissed about what Cleopatra was doing. This made Cleopatra and Ptolemy number 13 go to war with each other. Cleopatra was expelled from Alexandria. She was exiled to Syria, and she made it a girls' trip, and she took her sister Arsinoe with her. Back to Caesar and Pompey. Caesar had chased Pompey into Egypt. This was bad news bears for Pompey because Egyptians were Team Caesar. They believed that the gods favored Caesar, so of course they were Team Caesar because they didn't want to be smited by some god. So the Egyptians killed Pompey as soon as he stepped his ass on shore. Caesar claimed to be outraged about Pompey's assassination, but come on, the man was at war with Pompey. Do you really think that he was upset that the man was dead? Was Pompey's death not his end goal? Maybe he was upset that he didn't get to kill Pompey, but he was not upset that Pompey was dead. But Pompey being assassinated in Egypt worked out well for Cleopatra because it brought Caesar to Alexandria, and Cleopatra wanted to get Caesar on her side. Cleopatra had one big problem, though. She knew that there was no way that Ptolemy number 13's forces were just going to let her mosey on over to go talk to a Roman general so she could get him as an ally in a war against Ptolemy number 13. Cleopatra needed to think of a way to sneak into Alexandria, and this really shows just how clever she was. The story goes that she had wrapped herself in a carpet, though some sources say that it was a linen sack, and she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters. Caesar was impressed by this, and he became Team Cleopatra. And when I say he became Team Cleopatra, I mean he really became Team Cleopatra. Caesar started a sexual relationship with Cleopatra. Now, at this time, Caesar was married to a woman named Calpurnia, but don't worry about that because Caesar didn't. At first, Caesar wanted Cleopatra to make nice with Ptolemy number 13, and Cleopatra was like, fuck that, that is not happening. Now, when Cleopatra went into exile and she took her sister Arsinoe with her, she didn't do that because she loved her sister so much that she could not bear to be without her. She did this because she knew that Arsinoe wanted the throne, so it was a keep your friends close and your enemies closer type of situation. And 15-year-old Arsinoe made the decision that she was going to rule Egypt with Ptolemy number 13. Arsinoe managed to break free from Cleopatra and Caesar, and she joined the general Achilles. He was carrying out a very destructive siege of Alexandria. Arsinoe and Achilles ended up having a dispute, and she had him executed. She then put her mentor, Ganymede, in charge of the army. Arsinoe and her army was able to trap Cleopatra and Caesar in a palace for a whole year. Eventually, Arsinoe's army betrayed her, and they worked out an exchange. So the Egyptian army got Ptolemy number 13, and Caesar got Arsinoe. The war continued on. Ptolemy number 13 died in battle. He drowned while he was trying to cross the Nile River in 47 BC. He was 14 years old. Arsinoe was still Caesar's prisoner. She was sent to Rome in chains to be part of Caesar's victory parade. Usually the most important prisoners of a victory would be strangled, but Caesar spared her. He sent her to the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. During all of this, Cleopatra and Caesar carried on with their affair. Cleopatra was actually pregnant with their son, a son that was named Ptolemy No. 15 Caesarion, which means Little Caesar. This was Caesar's son, but Caesar never formally publicly acknowledged him as his son. After the war, Caesar did not annex Egypt. Instead, he gave it back to Cleopatra to rule with her brother, Ptolemy No. 14. Cleopatra married her now only living brother, so she got a new brother husband, and just like with the first brother husband, she really wasn't co-ruling with him. She was the one that was running the show by herself. Just because Cleopatra was now married to another one of her brothers didn't mean that she ended her affair with Caesar. In fact, Cleopatra, their son, and her brother husband number 2 followed Caesar to Rome. Caesar actually set them up in a house across the street from where he lived with his wife. Awkward. If you think that it sounds weird that Caesar moved his mistress across the street from his wife, then you are not alone. Even people in his time thought that it was weird. There was even a temple to Venus that was built, and Caesar had a bronze statue overlaid in gold of Cleopatra built in the temple. The Romans were not thrilled that there was a statue of a foreign queen in a temple to a goddess. Rome wasn't even a monarchy. Rome was a republic. Romans hated monarchs. This got Caesar into a little bit of trouble. Caesar was the dictator, and the Senate started to fear that he was going to turn Rome into a monarchy. So some of his friends and co-workers got together and stabbed Caesar, like a bunch of times. And getting stabbed a bunch of times is very hard to survive, so Caesar died. Cleopatra thought, okay, so my boy toy is dead, but I am the mother of his son. And Caesarion was the only known son of Caesar. Even though Caesar never formally acknowledged Caesarion, everyone knew that he was the daddy. Maury Povich's services were not needed. Cleopatra thought that her son was going to take over, but Rome was like, thanks, but no thanks. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, was now in charge. Octavian's mother, Atia, was Caesar's niece. Octavian would later change his name to Augustus, and that is who the month of August is named after. July is named after Caesar. Since Cleopatra's son wasn't going to rule, she left Rome. We are now in the year 44 BC. When Cleopatra returned to Egypt, her second brother husband, Ptolemy No. 14, died because he was poisoned, most certainly on Cleopatra's orders. He was about 15 years old. Cleopatra then made her son her co-ruler. Now, back to Rome for a moment. A man named Mark Antony formed a triumvirate with a man named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus and Octavian, which means that power was split between the three of them. Mark was a friend of Caesar's. He wasn't one of them that did any of the stabbing, though. Mark wanted to attack the Parthian Empire for some reason. We don't know why. Mark thought that getting Cleopatra on his side would be a smart move because he needed financial and military support because war requires soldiers and it's expensive. So Mark told Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, that is in modern-day Turkey. Cleopatra thought that it was a good idea to get another Roman on her side. So she went. Cleopatra's ship passed Mark Antony's ship, and she didn't get off of her ship. Her ship had purple sails. Purple was the most expensive dye you could get. Her ship's oars were made of silver, so she was trying to show off her wealth. When Cleopatra passed Mark's ship, he went after her. Cleopatra made him come to her because she was a queen in every sense of the word. She knew what she was doing. Mark went on to her ship, and she was reclined beneath a gold-spangled canopy. She was dressed like Venus. Young boys were dressed as cupids, and they stood by her and fanned her. Her fairest maids were dressed as sea nymphs and graces. There was incense. This was one of the most queen things that anyone has ever done. Cleopatra and Mark had their meeting. Mark fell in love with Cleopatra because, of course he did. She was a badass. They made a deal. Mark followed Cleopatra to Alexandria, and they became lovers, even though Mark was married to Octavian's sister, Octavia the Younger. Cleopatra asked Mark if he would have her sister Arsinoe murdered, because even though Arsinoe was not in Egypt, that didn't mean that she couldn't come back and kill Cleopatra. That was just how this family worked. In 41 BC, Mark ordered Arsinoe's death, and Arsinoe was executed on the steps of the temple. People were outraged by this. The temple was a sanctuary. People in Rome were pissed. Cleopatra and Mark continued on with their love affair, and Cleopatra got pregnant with twins. She gave birth to a boy and a girl. The boy was named Alexander Helios. He was named Alexander after Alexander the Great, and Helios means sun in ancient Greek. The girl was named Cleopatra Selene II. She was obviously named Cleopatra after her mother, and Selene means moon in ancient Greek. The twins were born around 40 BC. Cleopatra liked to party. They created a drinking club. This club was called Inimitable Livers. This club would have mighty feasts and wine binges. They would occasionally take part in games and contests. One of Cleopatra and Mark's favorite pastimes was supposedly they liked to go around Alexandria in disguise, and they would play pranks on its residents. Mark Antony was good friends with Herod the Great. He was the king of Judea. That is where present-day Israel and the Palestine West Bank are. Mark took some of Herod's territory away. He took Herod's royal date and balsam plantations, but because he was good friends with Herod, he didn't take all of his territory. So, Mark Antony was a good friend because he only stole some of his friend's stuff. Herod didn't like having Cleopatra so close to Jerusalem. That was the capital of his kingdom. So he leased back his territories from Cleopatra, and he paid her a very nice fee. Cleopatra tried to seduce Herod, but he was not swayed by her charm like Cleopatra and Mark Antony were, which was a good thing for him because she was probably trying to seduce him into a trap. Herod had seriously thought about killing Cleopatra, but his advisors were like, dude, that would not be a good idea. That would make Mark Antony super pissed. Herod did not want to do that, so instead he treated her nicely and gave her lots of expensive gifts and made sure that she made it to the Egyptian border safely. Cleopatra got pregnant by Mark Antony again. She had another boy in 36 BC. He was named Ptolemy Philadelphus because what this story needed was another person named Ptolemy. Cleopatra and Mark had a festival. This was to celebrate the annexation of Armenia. This was Mark Antony's only conquest in his Parthian campaign. At this festival, they gave their twins their middle names, and they got married. Mark declared Cleopatra the queen of Egypt, Cyprus, Libya, and Syria. Their children got Armenia, Medes, Parthia, Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. There were 2 thrones made of gold there, one for Cleopatra and the other one for Mark. There were 2 lower seated thrones for their sons. I guess their daughter just got the shaft. Cleopatra wore a robe that was sacred to Isis, and she was addressed as the new Isis. Mark was dressed as the god Dionysus. Now, this was long before the days of the internet and social media, but gossip has always found a way to get around. So, news of these events did make their way to Rome, and Octavian did hear about it. And he was not pleased. He didn't like Cleopatra to begin with, and he wasn't the biggest Mark Antony fan. And none of what took place at the festival made him join either of their fan clubs. Octavian then made it his goal in life to fuck up Mark Antony's life. He started spreading lies about Mark. He said that Mark wanted to establish a monarchy for Caesarion and that he had abandoned Roman traditions. He got what he claimed was Mark's will. We don't know if it was actually Mark's will. And he said that Mark bestowed Roman possessions on a foreign woman and that he intended to be buried beside Cleopatra in Egypt. In response to this, Octavian started building a massive tomb in Rome that he wanted to be buried in. He did that to prove that he was more Roman than Mark. Mark's will, saying that he wanted to be buried next to Cleopatra, also revived rumors that Mark wanted to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria. His will also named his children with Cleopatra as his heirs. Now, this wasn't the first time that Octavian had badmouthed Mark. Back in 35 BC, Octavia went to go see Mark in Athens. She brought with her vital supplies, travel animals, clothing, money, armor, and elite soldiers. Mark took the stuff and he had her sent away back to Rome without seeing her, which I do have to admit that was a real douchey thing to do, but Octavian knew that Cleopatra was Mark Antony's mistress, and he was the one that permitted Octavia to go see Mark, so he was hoping something like that would happen so he could throw dirt on Mark's name. Octavian said that Mark was enslaved to the passion and the witchery of Cleopatra. Octavian made flyers attacking Cleopatra because if he made Cleopatra look bad, that made Mark Antony look bad. Mark also gave as good as he got. If you think that political mudslinging is something that is new, you would be wrong. It has basically been around since the beginning of politics. Mark said that Octavian first betrothed his daughter to his son Antonius, and then to Cotsia, king of Geta. At the same time, he asked for the hand of the king's daughter for himself. He brought up rumors that Octavian had had a sexual relationship with his great-uncle / adopted father, Julius Caesar. That's right, folks. Salacious political rumors are not a 21st century invention. But for Mark, Octavian going into the temple of Vesta and taking his will and reading it out loud to the Senate was going too far. And he wasn't alone in that thinking. Most of the Senate thought that as well. The Vestal virgins were like half on Octavian's side. He had first requested that they give him the will, and they told him no. But they also said that they wouldn't stop him if he came in and took the will. Now, personally, out of everything that was said between Mark and Octavian, I think Mark saying that Octavian had a sexual relationship with his own great uncle / adopted father is way worse than Octavian taking and reading Mark's will, but that is just my opinion. Throughout this whole pissing contest between Mark and Octavian, Cleopatra was very busy being a queen, and she was a good ruler. She was said to be popular among her people, although I don't believe that she would have been very popular among condemned prisoners because she liked to carry out gruesome medical experiments on prisoners that were sentenced to death. One of these gruesome experiments was that she liked to test out poisons on prisoners. She was trying to find a poison that would cause you to die as quickly as possible and as painless as possible. Though the sages in ancient Egypt rejected her experiments, and there was even a rabbi that called her a fool when he heard about her medical hypothesis. Cleopatra also experimented on making cures. She worked on cures for baldness. Scholars have also attributed books on toxicology and cosmetics to Cleopatra. She also formulated skin brightening recipes as well as salves for helping contusions heal. It is also possible that she made a painkiller. And as the legend goes, her love for science helped her win a bet with Mark Antony. She bet him that she could spend 10 million sesterces on one single banquet. The next day, she hosted a banquet. During the second course, she had a servant place a vial of vinegar in front of her. She then removed one of her expensive pearl earrings and dropped the earring into the vinegar. And then she drank the vinegar. The vinegar had dissolved the pearl. So she had consumed more than 10 million sesterces in one banquet. She won the bet with Mark Antony. Now, back to Mark and Octavian. They went to war with each other, which I'm sure is not a shock that this is where it was headed. Cleopatra, of course, gave Mark aid to go to war. At this point, though, Mark had been booted from the council for obvious reasons. So now he was just a regular Roman citizen. So Cleopatra was funding a Roman citizen to go to war with Rome. This was illegal. Octavian, in response, declared war on Cleopatra for funding Mark's war. Octavian sold this war to his fellow Romans by claiming that he was only interested in Cleopatra. So more Romans got behind the war because it was presented as not being another Roman civil war. The war started off well for Cleopatra and Mark, but it didn't stay that way though. Their forces were already weakened due to the not-so-successful Parthenian campaign that I told you about, that Mark wanted to wage a few years prior. The Battle of Actium on September 2nd, 31 BC, was the beginning of the end for Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Octavian starved out Cleopatra and Mark's forces with a successful blockade. Allies started to desert them. Mark was either hoping for a win at sea because there was no way that he was getting a win by land because he was outmaneuvered, or he was trying to break the blockade by taking Cleopatra's advice to employ the fleet. Mark drew up his ships outside the bay facing west with Cleopatra's squadron behind him. The naval battle was hotly contested. Each side's squadrons tried to outflank the other. Then Cleopatra took her Egyptian galleys and got the hell out of there. Mark was able to take a few ships and follow her. With Cleopatra gone and Mark gone, Mark's fleet gave up and surrendered to Octavian. Mark's land forces gave up a week later. Octavian invaded Egypt in August of 30 BC with his general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. When Octavian invaded Egypt, Cleopatra had a message delivered to Mark Antony that said that she had taken her own life. So Mark decided that he was going to have a Romeo and Juliet moment, and he stabbed himself with his sword. He first ordered his slave Eros to kill him, but instead Eros killed himself with his sword. While Mark was bleeding out, he found out that Cleopatra was actually still alive. So he was still having a Romeo and Juliet moment. His friends took him to Cleopatra's monument because she was hiding there, and he died in her arms. Mark told Cleopatra, before he died, that she could trust Gaius Procreus on Octavian's side to treat her well. But Procreus used a ladder to climb into Cleopatra's tomb and detain her. Before that, Cleopatra was going to set herself and all of her treasures on fire. Octavian let Cleopatra hold a funeral for Mark Antony. Afterwards, she screamed and clawed at her skin. And this was just a part of the mourning process in her culture. Her skin got infected and she stopped eating, probably because she was trying to kill herself. Cleopatra had a meeting with Octavian, and he was really unclear whether or not he was going to spare her life. Octavian had his freedman Epaphroditus guard Cleopatra so she wouldn't try to kill herself, but that dude was really bad at his job because Cleopatra did kill herself. She was 39 years old. Octavian got a note from Cleopatra saying that she wanted to be buried next to Mark Antony. Octavian then rushed to go see her, but she was already dead, and her two handmaidens, Iris and Charlemagne, were dying. There is a claim that Octavian got trained snake charmers of the Silly tribe of ancient Egypt to try and extract venom and revive Cleopatra. Now, we don't know for sure how Cleopatra killed herself. The whole Cleopatra dying of a snake bite is probably not true. She may have poisoned herself. She had figs brought to her, and she may have had poison hidden in the basket, or the figs may have been poisoned. But the truth is, we do not know. The ancient historian and philosopher Plutarch said that Cleopatra concealed a deadly poison in one of her combs, but he also said that no one knows how she killed herself. The how is not known, but the why is, as the story goes, that a spy told Cleopatra that Octavian planned to take her back to Rome and parade her around as his prisoner. And she was like, fuck that. The historian Cassius Dio claimed that Octavian honored Cleopatra's wishes and had Cleopatra buried next to Mark Antony. But we don't know if that is true because we don't know where either one of them are buried. Before Octavian invaded Egypt, Cleopatra sent her son Caesarion to India, but he came back when Octavian promised him that he could rule Egypt. Then Octavian killed him. Caesarion was 17 years old. After this, Rome took over Egypt. Egypt became a province of Rome. Egypt got to keep their traditions, like their religion and mummification, but Rome was in charge. Cleopatra was Egypt's last pharaoh. Octavian also killed Mark's son, Marcus Antonius Antulus. That was the son that Mark had with his first wife, Fuphia. Octavian gave Cleopatra and Mark's children to Octavia to raise, which, poor Octavia, I have to feel a little sorry for her here. I can't imagine that it was easy to raise your husband's children that he had with his mistress. We don't know what happened to Cleopatra and Mark Antony's sons, but their daughter went on to marry a king. She married Jeba II of Numidia. She had children with him, including a son named Ptolemy, of course. Plutarch wrote Life of Antonius, and that has given us a lot of information about Cleopatra's life. She has been depicted in art many times, way too many to mention or even put on this podcast's TikTok and Instagram. The asteroid 216 Cleopatra is named after her. There have been ballads about her life. Colgate-Palmolive has a beauty line that has beauty cream, soap, lotions, and it's named after Cleopatra. She has been depicted in many comics. There are many novels that depict Cleopatra. I will make a list of them and put them on Bookshop. There have been many movies made about her. The most famous movie about Cleopatra is the 1963 movie that stars Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra and Richard Burton as Caesar. I personally am most familiar with the 1999 version of Cleopatra. That one has Billy Zane as Mark Antony. I had that on VHS as a kid, and it's like 3 hours long. And I watched it over and over again. I think it actually started to drag. I was absolutely obsessed with Cleopatra when I was a child, and I still am. That movie isn't 100% accurate, but it's good. I highly recommend it. She has been in video games, and she's been depicted in plays, including Antony and Cleopatra by History Shelf alumni William Shakespeare. Poets have written about Cleopatra. There are operas about her life, and many songwriters have put her in their songs, including Taylor Swift. Taylor mentions her in her song When Emma Falls in Love, and that is track number 18 on Speak Now, Taylor's version. It is a vault track. And that was the life of Queen Cleopatra VII. Thank you so much for listening to the second episode of the 5th season of History Shelf. I am covering 14 people this season, like I said in the intro. I don't know how many episodes that's going to be. Next week's episode is going to be about Niccolo Machiavelli. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month, and with that, you will get a shout out from me on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zippa Putty. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, you can click on one of the affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, one for Amazon, and one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support this podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in this episode's show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would also be very helpful. Well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.